160 feet of stone and iron, 50,000 tons of material, 50 years of construction, one man. Bishop Castle has stood at 9,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies for half a century now. Through 90-mile-per-hour winds that ripped roofs off buildings below, through blizzards that buried cars on Highway 165, through a fire that destroyed every wooden structure on the property while leaving the stone walls untouched. No structural collapse, not once in 55 years. Engineers said a building without blueprints would fall. The county said it violated every code. His own father said it was too much work and walked away. Jim Bishop built it anyway. This is how a high school dropout proved them wrong. The dragon breathes fire at 9,000 feet. Flames roar from its mouth, orange and black, propane-fed, visible for miles across the San Isabel National Forest. Below the dragon, a stone tower rises 160 feet into the Colorado sky. Gothic arches, wrought iron bridges, spiral staircases climbing through the clouds, a castle sitting on a mountainside where no castle should exist. It has stood here for more than 50 years, through blizzards that buried cars on Highway 165, through 90-mile-per-hour winds that ripped roofs off buildings in the valley below, through decades of government inspectors, building code violations, federal agents, and felony charges. It has never fallen. The Bureau of Land Management tried to stop it. The Colorado Department of Transportation tried to stop it. Custer County issued citations and filed injunctions. Engineers said the walls would collapse. Neighbors said the towers would topple. His own father said it was too much work and walked away. One man built it anyway. No blueprints, no cranes, no engineering degree, no outside financing. Stone by stone for 50 years while working a day job in his father's iron shop. He moved more than 50,000 tons of material to heights that his homemade equipment could barely reach. He dug foundations 12 feet into bedrock with hand tools. He taught himself Gothic architecture from library books and made every mistake into art. His name was Jim Bishop, and on November 21, 2024, he died at 80 years old, leaving behind what may be the largest one-man construction project in human history. The castle remains, free and open to the public, exactly as he intended. But 65 years earlier, Jim Bishop had never laid a single stone. In 1959, Jim Bishop was 15 years old and already a failure. That was what his English teacher at Pueblo South High School had told him. The argument started over something small. Jim couldn't even remember what years later. But he remembered the ending, the teacher's face, the words that came out of her mouth in front of the entire class. "You'll never amount to anything, Jim Bishop." He dropped out that day, never went back. It wasn't the first time someone had written him off. Jim had been a sickly child, born in Honolulu in 1944 to parents from Pueblo, Colorado. A kidney infection in early childhood was so severe that doctors told his parents he wouldn't survive past 5. He was small, awkward, self-conscious about his appearance. "Big ears, big nose," he said later. "I never seemed to fit in." But something happened to Jim Bishop between childhood and adolescence. He discovered his father's ornamental iron shop in Pueblo, where Willard Bishop built gates and railings and decorative metalwork. Jim learned to weld. He learned to work with his hands, and somewhere along the way he discovered weightlifting. By his late teens, Jim Bishop could curl 150-pound dumbbells. The sickly boy had transformed himself into something his doctors never imagined possible. But the teacher's words stayed with him. They would stay with him for the rest of his life. The summer he dropped out, Jim was riding bicycles with friends along Highway 165, climbing into the wet mountains west of Pueblo. The road wound through stands of pine and aspen, gaining elevation with every mile. At 9,000 feet, surrounded on 3 sides by San Isabel National Forest, Jim spotted a plot of land that stopped him cold. 2.5 acres, mountain views in every direction, no neighbors, no rules, no one to tell him what he could or couldn't do. He had $450 saved from mowing lawns, delivering newspapers, and working in his father's shop. The asking price was exactly $450. Jim was too young to sign the deed himself. He convinced his parents to co-sign, And just like that, the high school dropout who would never amount to anything owned a piece of the Rocky Mountains. For the next 10 summers, Jim and his father Willard camped on the land. They cleared timber. They built a driveway. They planned what every mountain property owner plans: a family cabin. Nothing more. A place to escape Pueblo on weekends. A retreat in the pines. In June of 1969, when Jim was 25, they started building. A one-room stone cottage with an Eiffel Tower-shaped fireplace and arched windows. Rocks were free, the mountains were covered in them. Jim hauled them from creek beds and highway ditches, loaded them into his truck, and stacked them into walls. The cottage took shape slowly. Jim worked weekdays at the iron shop and drove up on weekends. He married Phoebe Noakes in 1967. She was 17, he was 21, and they'd met over a Coke at a Pueblo soda fountain. "We just meshed," Phoebe said later. "We were soulmates." She came to the mountain with him, helped where she could, and waited while he worked. By 1971, the cottage was nearly finished, but they had a problem. They needed water. The nearest source was too far to pipe, and drilling a well at 9,000 feet would cost more than Jim had. Willard Bishop found a solution. The Sacred Heart Orphanage in Pueblo was tearing down an old building. Among the salvage was a 40-foot metal cylinder, perfect for a gravity-fed cistern. They could mount it on the hillside above the cottage, collect rainwater and snowmelt, and let gravity do the rest. Jim and Willard hauled the cylinder up the mountain, stood it upright, and began cladding it in stone to protect it from the elements. They added a spiral staircase up the side so they could access the top. When they finished, they stepped back and looked at what they'd built. A round stone tower with a staircase wrapping around it. Arched windows below. The cottage attached to its base. It looked exactly like a castle turret. Within months, motorists on Highway 165 were pulling over to stare. Ranchers from the valley started asking questions. A couple caught in a rainstorm found the property and was thrilled to have discovered the castle in the mountains. By 1972, strangers were stopping at the Wet Mountain Valley General Store, asking for directions. "You know how to get to that castle someone's building?" Jim Bishop heard the question enough times that something shifted inside him. The teacher's voice: "You'll never amount to anything." The doctors who said he'd die before 5. The years of feeling like he never fit in, all of it pressing against a new possibility. What if he actually built them a castle? In the spring of 1973, Jim started digging. Not a foundation for a cabin addition, a foundation for something else entirely. He dug down 12 feet, all the way to bedrock, anchoring whatever came next to the mountain itself. His father Willard watched him work for a while, then asked what he was doing. Jim looked up from the hole. "The people want a castle," he said, "and I'm going to build them a castle." Willard Bishop stared at his son. The dropout. The kid who'd been sick his whole childhood. The one who'd transformed himself through sheer will but still couldn't seem to stay out of trouble. "That's just too much work," Willard said, and he walked away from the project entirely. Jim Bishop was alone. His father's departure wasn't the last word of doubt he would hear. It was the first in a chorus that would last 50 years. Willard had helped clear the land, build the cottage, and create the accidental turret. But the vision of an actual castle, built by hand, stone by stone, by one man without professional training, that was too far. Too much work became the refrain Jim heard everywhere he turned. His neighbors in the Wet Mountain Valley were ranchers and farmers. Practical people who built practical things. They watched the stone walls rising on the mountainside and shook their heads. "That thing's going to fall down," said one rancher who Jim quoted often in later years. "You can't build that high without engineering. First big wind, it's coming down." Another neighbor was more direct. "You're wasting your time, Bishop, and your money. What happens when you run out of rocks you can lift?" Jim had no engineering degree. He had no blueprints. He had no formal training in masonry or construction. What he had was his father's ironworking expertise, a library card, and a complete unwillingness to accept limits that other people set for him. He started visiting the library in Pueblo, checking out books on Gothic architecture, medieval construction techniques, and structural engineering principles. He studied flying buttresses, the external supports that allowed Gothic cathedrals to rise higher than any buildings before them. He learned about load distribution, arch construction, and the properties of stone under compression. And then he did what he always did. he figured it out himself. When you don't have money for engineering, Jim said later, you need ingenious. His approach was simple: overbuild everything. Where a wall might need to be 8 feet thick, Jim made it 16. Where a foundation might need to go 6 feet deep, he went 12. He poured concrete into gaps, reinforced corners with rebar, and anchored every major element to bedrock. If he couldn't calculate the exact load a structure would bear, he built it to bear 10 times what he guessed. But the skeptics weren't wrong about one thing: the work was brutal. Each stone had to be found, loaded, transported, unloaded, positioned, and mortared. According to Jim's son Daniel, every rock was handled approximately 6 times before reaching its final position. Jim collected them from highway ditches where the state had cleared rock slides, from creek beds in the San Isabel forest, and from fields as far away as Westcliff. He mixed mortar by hand in 5-gallon buckets. He hauled it uphill. He built his own scaffolding from scrap lumber and rebuilt it every time he gained another story of height. The work happened on weekends and summer vacations. 5 days a week, Jim ran the ornamental iron shop in Pueblo, fulfilling contracts for gates, railings, and decorative metalwork. Saturdays and Sundays, he drove 90 minutes up Highway 165 and laid stone until dark. Phoebe came when she could. She helped with the lighter work and kept the accounts. But this was Jim's obsession now. The castle wasn't a family project anymore. It was something else, something that consumed him. By 1978, the walls were high enough that Jim started worrying about lateral forces. A wildfire had burned over Greenhorn Mountain that year, and watching the wind push flames across the ridge gave him nightmares about his walls falling outward. He went back to the library. He read about Notre Dame. He studied the flying buttresses that had held Gothic cathedrals upright for 800 years. Then he built his own. The Bureau of Land Management arrived in the early 1980s. Jim had been collecting rocks from San Isabel National Forest for years. Highway ditches, creek beds, anywhere loose stone accumulated. He saw himself as providing a service, clearing debris that would otherwise cause problems. The Forest Service saw it differently. A BLM agent showed up at the castle one afternoon with a clipboard and a stern expression. Jim was mortaring stones 30 feet up, and he climbed down to meet the man. "You've been removing material from federal land," the agent said. "You need a commercial rock permit." Jim wiped mortar from his hands. "How much?" The price the agent quoted was more than Jim spent on materials in a year. He couldn't afford it. More than that, he found it absurd, paying the government for rocks that were otherwise sitting in ditches causing drainage problems. "That's not going to work," Jim said. The BLM disagreed. They sent letters. They threatened fines. They made clear that Jim Bishop would stop taking rocks from federal land or face prosecution. Jim's response was characteristic. He did some research of his own and discovered that someone at the local BLM office had been doing something unethical. He never said publicly what it was. But when the next meeting came, Jim made clear that he knew, and that if the rock permits became a legal battle, other things might become public too. The settlement, 10 cents per ton. Jim could live with that. He paid his dime per ton and kept building. But the BLM wasn't done. Within a year, they raised the price to 50 cents. Jim grumbled, but paid. Then they raised it again. Jim's countermove was creative. He posted a sign at the castle entrance with a message. "The Bureau of Land Management is trying to stop this castle from being built. If you think that's wrong, here's their phone number." Hundreds of visitors called. The BLM office was paralyzed, every phone line tied up with angry tourists demanding to know why the government was harassing a man for picking up loose rocks. Within days, the BLM came back to negotiate. Rocks were never a problem again. But the BLM was only the first government agency to take notice of what Jim Bishop was building. The Colorado Department of Transportation cited him for unauthorized roadside signage. Jim had put up signs along Highway 165 directing visitors to the castle, hand-painted arrows, nothing fancy, but the state said they violated the Lady Bird Johnson Highway Beautification Act of 1965, which regulated roadside advertising. Jim's solution? He rebuilt his mailbox. The new mailbox was shaped like a miniature castle, complete with towers and an arrow pointing toward the property. Technically, it was a mailbox, not a sign. The Highway Beautification Act didn't cover mailboxes. The state was not amused. A month later, they demanded the mailbox be removed. Jim posted another sign. The Colorado Highway Department is trying to silence a taxpayer. Here's their phone number. The Highway Patrol's phones rang non-stop. Tourists, locals, people who'd never been to the castle but didn't like the idea of government bureaucrats harassing a man over a mailbox. Within days, the state relented. In 1996, the government installed official road signs directing visitors to Bishop Castle. Jim considered it a surrender. Custer County was the most persistent adversary. The county had building codes, height restrictions, permit requirements. According to most sources, the limit was somewhere between 25 and 45 feet, and the castle was already well past 100. The county sent inspectors. The inspectors wrote citations. The citations demanded that Jim either obtain proper permits, hire a licensed engineer to certify the structure, or tear it down. Jim's response was legal judo. He invoked the Laches Doctrine, a principle that prevents authorities from enforcing regulations after decades of inaction. The county had watched him build for years without objection. They had accepted property taxes on an increasingly valuable structure. They had let tourists flood in without requiring commercial permits. They couldn't suddenly decide the castle was illegal. The legal back and forth dragged on through the 1980s. Jim kept building. The county kept threatening. Neither side gave ground. What finally shifted the equation wasn't law, it was economics. By the early 1990s, Bishop Castle was drawing thousands of visitors per year. They stayed in local motels. They ate at local restaurants. They bought gas at local stations. The castle that Custer County wanted to condemn was becoming one of Custer County's most valuable assets. County Tourism Chair Deb Adams acknowledged it openly. Bishop Castle is one of our main attractions in Custer County. Phoebe put it more bluntly. Once they realize that the entire community of their county makes more money than we do on the visitors, they don't bother us. The citations stopped. The inspectors stopped coming. The county that had tried to tear down the castle started putting it on promotional materials. But Jim Bishop wasn't building for the county's approval. He wasn't building for tourists. He wasn't even building to prove his father wrong, though that was part of it. He was building because he couldn't stop. By 1987, the castle had 3 stories, multiple towers connected by iron bridges, and a growing reputation as one of the strangest roadside attractions in America. Jim had developed techniques that professional engineers would later study. His pulley system, a cable running from his old Dodge pickup through a series of blocks and tackles, could lift 1,000 pounds of stone at a time. A StoryCorps interview from 1994 captured the scene. Attached to the front of this truck is a cable, part of a pulley system which is gradually hoisting about 1,000 pounds of Colorado granite up the side of a 100-foot tall tower. He built his own scaffolding, dismantled it, rebuilt it at the next level, and repeated the process dozens of times. He felled trees and milled them into lumber himself for floors and structural supports. His ironworking skills from the family business meant he could fabricate staircases, bridges, and railings in his shop in Pueblo, drive them up the mountain, and weld them into place. Visitors described the ironwork as intricately crafted like crochet. Every spiral staircase, every bridge railing, every balcony support, welded by hand. The physical toll was immense. Jim worked until his muscles couldn't lift anymore, then rested until they could. He lost weight during intensive building periods, gained it back during winters when snow made work impossible. His hands were calloused and scarred, his back ached constantly. But the castle kept rising. In the mid-1980s, Jim created the structure's most iconic feature. A local hospital was discarding stainless steel warming trays, the kind used to keep food hot in cafeterias. Jim collected thousands of them. He hammered each one into a scale-like curve, riveted them onto a steel frame, and created a dragon head that emerged from the castle's highest tower. Then he installed a hot air balloon burner in the dragon's throat. Propane and diesel mixed in a fireball that shot through the mouth and nostrils. The dragon breathed fire. Tourists who had come expecting a quirky roadside attraction found something else entirely. They found a man's life work, a physical manifestation of every doubt he'd ever faced and refused to accept. The teacher who said he'd never amount to anything, the doctors who said he wouldn't live past 5, the father who said it was too much work, the neighbours who said it would fall down, the government agencies that said it was illegal. Jim answered all of them the same way. He kept building. By 1988, the castle stood over 100 feet tall. More than 1,000 tons of rock had been moved into place. The walls were holding, the towers were standing. The skeptics were running out of predictions. And then, in May of that year, Jim Bishop's 4-year-old son Roy went to the castle with his father for what was supposed to be a day of work. Jim was clearing timber on the hillside above the structure. The trees he felled would become lumber for floors and supports. Roy was there, playing nearby while his father worked. No one knows exactly what happened. A tree fell in a direction Jim didn't anticipate, or Roy moved somewhere he shouldn't have been, or both. The trunk came down on the boy before anyone could stop it. Roy Bishop was killed instantly. The man who had built his castle to prove he could overcome anything faced something that stone and iron could not fix. His son was dead. The castle had cost him something he could never get back, and the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life arrived without mercy. Was any of this worth it? Jim Bishop did not stop building. In the weeks after Roy's death, he returned to the castle. He mixed mortar, he laid stone, he climbed scaffolding that creaked under his weight and set rocks in place one at a time, the way he had for 15 years. Some people thought he'd lost his mind. His wife Phoebe understood. "Well, what am I going to run to?" Jim said when someone asked why he kept working. He loved this place. Roy's ashes were interred within the castle walls. The highest tower, the one Jim was still building when his son died, was named Roy's Tower. Jim made a decision that day. Roy's Tower would never be finished. It would stand permanently incomplete, a monument to what the castle had cost. That same year, Jim completed the castle's glass-ceilinged atrium. Phoebe called it something that cut to the bone. He built it to catch his tears. The skeptics who had predicted collapse watched the walls keep rising. The neighbours who said it was too much work watched Jim haul stone through his grief. The government agencies that had tried to stop him watched tourists keep coming, more every year, drawn by word of mouth and the growing legend of the one-man castle in the mountains. Through the 1990s, Jim added stained glass windows. He built a grand ballroom that would eventually host more than 350 weddings. He connected towers with iron bridges that swayed slightly in the mountain wind, terrifying to some visitors, exhilarating to others. He welded a 30-foot steel steeple that brought the total height to approximately 160 feet. He stopped there, not because he wanted to, but because his homemade pulley system couldn't reach any higher. The castle had become something beyond a building. It was a physical argument, 160 feet of stone and iron that said, "You were wrong about me, all of you," but the tests weren't over. The hardest ones were still coming. The trouble started with the parties. By the late 1990s, Bishop Castle had become a destination. Not just for tourists who wanted to see the dragon breathe fire, but for people who wanted to use the castle for events. Jim allowed it. He believed in freedom, freedom to build, freedom to visit, freedom to gather. The castle was open to everyone, always, no admission charged. What Jim didn't anticipate was what everyone would eventually include. All-night raves began appearing on the castle calendar. Hundreds of people driving up Highway 165 after dark, parking in the meadows and partying until dawn. Music echoing off the stone walls. Substances that weren't legal anywhere, let alone on a family's private property in rural Colorado. Neighbors complained. The county received reports of drug use, noise violations, trespassing on adjacent land. Jim tried to manage it, posting rules, limiting hours, turning away the worst offenders. But the castle had become bigger than he could control. In August of 2002, everything collapsed. A wedding was scheduled at the castle. But the wedding guests didn't leave when the ceremony ended. They stayed. More people arrived. The party grew. By nightfall, it had transformed into exactly what the county had been warning about, an out-of-control gathering that showed no signs of stopping. Jim and his son Daniel tried to clear the property. They asked people to leave. They demanded people to leave. The partygoers refused. What happened next would land both bishops in court facing felony charges. According to prosecutors, Daniel Bishop fired a shotgun to disperse the crowd. The blast sent partygoers running. No one was hit, but the terror was real. Within days, Custer County filed charges, 15 to 17 counts of felony, menacing against both Jim and Daniel Bishop. Jim's bail was set at $50,000, cash only. He called it unconstitutional. He called it persecution. He called it exactly what he'd always said government was: legal criminals, using the law as a weapon against citizens who wouldn't submit. The man who had fought the BLM over rocks and the Highway Department over mailboxes was now facing years in prison. The castle that had survived every prediction of collapse might finally fall, not to engineering failure or natural disaster, but to a court order that would take its builder away. The trial became a referendum on Jim Bishop himself. Prosecutors painted a picture of a dangerous man, someone who had flouted building codes, defied government agencies, and now escalated to firearms when he didn't get his way. They called witnesses who described the chaos of that night, the fear when the shotgun blast echoed off stone walls. Jim's defense was simpler. There was no evidence that anyone fired a gun inside the castle. A forensic expert took the stand. He had examined the scene, tested for gunshot residue, analyzed the acoustics. His conclusion: no shots were fired inside the castle structure. Whatever had happened that night, it hadn't happened the way prosecutors claimed. The jury deliberated. Jim Bishop, the high school dropout who would never amount to anything, sat in a courtroom waiting to learn if he would spend the next decade in prison. The verdict came back. Not guilty on all charges. Daniel was acquitted on 16 of 17 counts. The single conviction, reckless endangerment, a misdemeanor, resulted in 30 days in jail and 2 years of probation. Jim walked out of that courthouse the same way he'd walked away from every fight with every government agency: unbowed, unbroken, already planning his next move. But the trial had changed something. The all-night parties stopped. The castle implemented stricter rules about events, and Jim, for all his talk about freedom, recognized that there were limits to what even he could control. The castle wasn't just his anymore. It belonged to everyone who visited, and that meant protecting it, even from the people who claimed to love it. The next test came from inside his own body. In 2015, Jim Bishop was diagnosed with Merkel cell carcinoma, a rare and aggressive skin cancer. The word the doctors used was incurable. Jim's response was characteristic. Carcinoma means incurable. Incurable, my ass. He underwent radiation treatment that ravaged him physically. The man who had once curled 150-pound dumbbells, who had hauled 1,000-pound stones up the side of a tower, watched his body shrink. His daughter Donita described the transformation. The radiation shrank him, making him a shell of his former bodybuilding self. He kept building, not at the pace of his younger years, not with the same strength, but Jim Bishop still drove up Highway 165 on weekends, still climbed the scaffolding, still set stones in place. The cancer hadn't killed him. He wasn't going to let it stop him either. Then came the Parkinson's diagnosis. The disease that had taken Muhammad Ali, that had reduced Michael J. Fox to tremors and uncertainty, began its slow work on Jim Bishop. His hands, the hands that had welded every iron railing, mixed every bucket of mortar, lifted every stone, started to shake. Daniel watched his father struggle, watched him reach for tools and miss, watched him try to climb stairs that had once been effortless. Eventually, Daniel had to take away his father's truck keys. He changed the code on the Bobcat so Jim couldn't operate heavy equipment. The man who had built a castle by himself could no longer be trusted to drive. Jim's last physical work on the castle came in 2019. He was 75 years old, weakened by cancer treatment, slowed by Parkinson's. He couldn't mix mortar anymore, couldn't carry the buckets, couldn't control the trowel. So he set small rocks along the Great Wall without mortar. Dry stacked them into place, one at a time, the way he'd started 50 years earlier. It was the only work his body would still allow. The fire came on March 28, 2018. Jim and Phoebe were at their home in Pueblo when they got the call. The castle's gift shop was burning. The guest house next to it was burning. Flames visible from Highway 165, smoke rising into the mountain sky. By the time fire crews arrived, both buildings were destroyed. The gift shop had been the bishop's primary income source. Visitors bought souvenirs, donated to the castle's maintenance fund, purchased food and drinks. It wasn't much money. Jim had never charged admission, never tried to commercialize what he'd built, but it was enough to keep the property running. "That gift shop was our rent," Jim said afterward. "It was like a nightmare." But the stone castle itself was untouched. The fire had consumed everything made of wood: the gift shop, the guest house, the storage buildings. Everything that could burn had burned, and the castle, 160 feet of stone and iron, built without blueprints by a high school dropout, stood exactly where it had stood for 50 years. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Modern construction, built to code with permits and inspections and professional contractors, had been reduced to ash. Jim Bishop's castle, which every authority had said would fall, remained standing. Phoebe died of cancer in 2018, just months after the fire. They had been married more than 50 years. She was the 17-year-old he'd met over a Coke at a Pueblo soda fountain, the one who had waited at home while he built his impossible dream, the one who understood why he kept going even when no one else did. A newspaper reporter who visited the castle shortly after Phoebe's death described what he found. Jim sitting silently with his small dog Pumpkin, staring at the walls he had built for her. The man who was never silent, who had ranted about government overreach, who had posted signs on every available surface, who had opinions about everything and shared them with anyone who would listen, had nothing to say. Jim had told a reporter once that the whole castle was for Phoebe. An immense monument to the love for a woman. Now she was gone. And Jim was alone with what he'd built. The final years were quiet. Jim's health continued to decline. The Parkinson's advanced. His strength faded. Daniel took over day-to-day management of the castle, greeting visitors, maintaining the structures, keeping the dragon's fire-breathing apparatus working. Jim still came when he could. He sat in the castle and watched tourists climb the stairs he'd built, cross the bridges he'd welded, touch the stones he'd laid. He listened to their amazement, the gasps when they saw how high the towers reached, the nervous laughter when they realized there were no guardrails, the questions about how one man could possibly have done this. He had answers for the questions. He always had. But the combative edge was gone. His daughter Valerie noticed the change. The man who had railed against government corruption, who had posted conspiracy theories and constitutional arguments on every wall, who had built an entire castle partly out of spite, that man was fading. He seemed much more interested in his kids, Valerie said. Toward the end, Jim asked her to turn off How the Grinch Stole Christmas because it was too negative. The man who had spent 50 years fighting everyone who tried to stop him had finally found something like peace. On November 20th, 2024, Valerie told her father that Daniel and the family were taking care of the castle. Everything was handled. He didn't need to worry. Jim's response carried the weight of a man who had spent 65 years proving what he could do. "Okay, well, I guess if everything is being taken care of, I'm okay to go." He died the next morning, November 21st, 2024. He was 80 years old. The news spread quickly. Local stations in Colorado Springs and Pueblo led with the story. The Denver Post ran a feature. National outlets picked it up. NPR, Atlas Obscura, travel blogs that had listed Bishop Castle as a must-see destination for decades. The obituaries all said the same thing. Jim Bishop, builder of Bishop Castle, had died. The castle remained. And that was the point, wasn't it? The teacher who said he'd never amount to anything. She was long gone, her name forgotten, remembered only for the words she'd spoken to a 15-year-old boy who would spend the rest of his life proving her wrong. The doctors who said he'd die before 5, their predictions had missed by 75 years. His father Willard, who said it was too much work and walked away, he'd watched his son build something that would outlast them both. The neighbors who said the walls would collapse, they'd watched those walls stand for 50 years, through blizzards and windstorms and everything the Rocky Mountains could throw at them. The Bureau of Land Management, the Highway Department, Custer County, all of them had tried to stop Jim Bishop. None of them had succeeded. The prosecutors who charged him with felony menacing, he'd walked out of court not guilty. The cancer that was supposed to be incurable, he'd outlived the prognosis by 9 years. And now he was gone, and the castle was still standing, and the question that had driven him for 65 years had finally been answered. You'll never amount to anything, Jim Bishop. 160 feet, 50,000 tons, 50 years, one man. Daniel Bishop gave his first interview as sole caretaker in March of 2025. He was careful with his words. The castle wasn't just his inheritance, it was his father's legacy, and he understood the weight of that. Determined, headstrong, driven, sure of himself, Daniel said when asked to describe his father. Had a dream and followed through with it. The reporter asked if Daniel planned to continue building. Daniel's answer revealed both respect and wisdom. If someone picked up a Picasso and started painting on it, then it's not a Picasso anymore. He would maintain what his father built. He would keep the dragon breathing fire. He would finish Roy's Tower, something Jim had deliberately left incomplete as a memorial to the son he lost. But he wouldn't fundamentally alter what Jim had created. I'll let the place grow organically like he did, Daniel said. The castle remains open daily, free of charge, exactly as Jim intended. No admission fee, no corporate sponsor, no government funding, just a stone castle at 9,000 feet, built by a high school dropout who refused to accept anyone else's definition of what was possible. Visitors still come by the thousands every year. They climb the spiral staircases, cross the iron bridges, stand at the top of the 160-foot tower, and look out at the San Isabel National Forest stretching to the horizon. They watch the dragon breathe fire and wonder how any of this is real. TripAdvisor ranks it the #1 attraction in Rye, Colorado. It holds a Traveler's Choice Award. It appears on Atlas Obscura, Roadside America, and the official Colorado State Tourism website. It has been featured on NPR's StoryCorps, preserved now in the Library of Congress, in Ripley's Believe It or Not, and in multiple documentaries. No major structural collapse or failure has ever been reported. After 55 years at 9,000 feet elevation, through snow loads that have crushed modern buildings, through winds that have torn roofs off houses in the valley, through the fire that destroyed everything wooden on the property, the stone castle has never fallen. The engineering that didn't exist on paper existed in Jim Bishop's hands. The blueprints that were never drawn were written in the walls themselves. There's a story Jim told about the early years before anyone thought he might succeed. A structural engineer visited the castle in the 1980s, back when the walls were still rising and the neighbours were still predicting collapse. The engineer walked around the base, studied the foundation, examined the stonework. Then he climbed the scaffolding and looked at how the towers connected to the main structure. When he came down, Jim asked what he thought. The engineer was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Jim never forgot. "I don't know how to tell you this," the engineer said, "but what you're building, it shouldn't work. The load distribution is wrong. The materials aren't consistent. There's no formal foundation design. By every principle I learned in school, this should have fallen down years ago." Jim waited. "But it's standing," the engineer said, "and I think it's going to keep standing. Because you've overbuilt everything so massively that you've accidentally created something more stable than most buildings I've certified." The high school dropout had out-engineered the engineers by refusing to believe he couldn't. What does Jim Bishop's castle prove? It proves that expertise can be self-taught, that official credentials matter less than relentless effort, that every institution in America, educational, governmental, professional, can be wrong about what one person can accomplish. It proves that doubt is fuel, that mockery can be transformed into motivation, that the words "you'll never amount to anything" can echo for 65 years and be answered stone by stone with evidence that cannot be denied. It proves that tragedy doesn't have to end a dream. Roy's death could have broken Jim Bishop. It nearly did. But he returned to the walls anyway, and the castle became something larger than himself. A memorial to his son, a monument to his wife, an answer to everyone who ever said it couldn't be done. And it proves that vindication sometimes takes 50 years. The bureaucrats who demanded permits are retired now, or dead. The neighbours who predicted collapse have watched the castle outlive their certainty. The teacher who told a 15-year-old boy he would never amount to anything has been disproven by 160 feet of stone that tourists travel from around the world to see. Every year, on winter days when the mountain is quiet and the tourists are few, Daniel Bishop climbs to the top of the castle and looks out at the view his father saw for 50 years. The San Isabel National Forest stretching toward the horizon. The peaks of the Sangre de Cristo Range catching the last light. The highway far below, winding through the valley where ranchers once shook their heads at the crazy man building a castle. The walls are cold under his hands. The iron railings, everyone welded by his father, are slick with frost. The wind cuts through at 9,000 feet the way it always has, indifferent to human ambition, indifferent to legacy, indifferent to whether the structure below it was supposed to be possible. But the structure is there, still standing, still open, still free. Daniel thinks about his father's last words. I guess if everything is being taken care of, I'm okay to go. The permission a man gives himself when his life's work is finally complete. He thinks about Roy's tower, still unfinished, a memorial to a 4-year-old boy who never got to see what his father would build. He thinks about Phoebe, who waited at home while Jim transformed himself from a sickly kid into the builder of the impossible. He thinks about the teacher. You'll never amount to anything, Jim Bishop. And he looks down at the castle his father built. No blueprints, no cranes, no engineering degree, no help from anyone once Will had walked away, and he understands what Jim understood. The castle is the answer. It was always the answer. Not words, not arguments, not lawsuits or signs or phone campaigns against government bureaucrats. Just stone, iron, 50 years, one man. The dragon breathes fire at 9,000 feet, and the castle built to prove everyone wrong is still standing, exactly where a 15-year-old dropout said it would be, 65 years ago, when no one believed he could do anything at all.